My name is Arun Kundnani. I'm the author of What is Antiracism and Why It Means Anticapitalism, and a book called The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. So obviously, Kamala Harris ran a terrible campaign. The biggest disappointment was the failure to alter course on Gaza. You can't claim to be the anti-fascist candidate at home if you're gunning for fascists abroad, which is, of course, what she was doing. The other problem was she ran in defense of democracy, right? Which is an abstraction. Like, if you really want to defend democracy, you run on a campaign advocating policies that might actually improve people's lives and demonstrate that there might be some value in democracy that way. But she didn't do that. She ran on Biden's record, which for most people in the United States has been a time of austerity. Whether it's rising prices, precarious employment, or whether it's the fact that benefits like the child tax credit were withdrawn. That was a terrible mistake, and that's a big part of why she lost. In terms of a Donald Trump campaign, look at it globally, right? This is the hour of the far right. I mean, it's their time. They're breaking new ground politically all across the world. You look at the last year alone. They've done very well in France, in Holland, they're doing well in India, even though they had a reduced vote. They're still in office in India. Look at what happened in the summer in the UK, where you had racist pogroms, people turning up at mosques and hotels housing asylum seekers with murderous intent to try and set these places on fire and kill people. And this is not just the kind of fringe neo-Nazis anymore. I mean, if you look at the videos, you'll see parents taking their kids along to these kind of events, like a family day out at the lynching kind of thing. So, there is a global thing going on, and we need to make sense of that. And so some of what's happened here in the US with the election is specific to Trump and to the US, but it's also part of this broader thing. And I think to get into it and understand it, we need to look at the kind of unraveling of neoliberalism. And we need to look at the way that Trumpism is the war on terror coming home. So in terms of neoliberalism, we've had, since the 1990s, this idea that if we organize societies according to the rules of the market, organize the distribution of resources in that way, that, everything's going to be hunky-dory. And that remains the kind of official ideology. That is still the way that resources are distributed in society. But what's happened since 2008, and especially what's happened since COVID, and I think COVID is underestimated as a factor here in the kind of current rise of neo-fascism. What's happened is that the kind of contradictions of living like that, right? Living in this way where we imagine ourselves as these kind of sovereign individual consumers able to command pleasures in the marketplace. It's just no longer livable, right? It's just no longer livable because economically it's not working, because except for a wealthy elite, most of us aren't able to command pleasures in the marketplace in that way that neoliberalism imagines. We don't have enough of an income. But equally, what the financial crisis and especially what COVID did was make very palpable this sense that we are in fact lodged in a whole load of social and political and biological dependencies, right, that require us to be, that bind us up to society, right? And so what has been impossible to avoid is the fact that we can't understand our relationships to each other just as market transactions. It's the return of the social, right? It's the return of the social. And so the credibility of neoliberalism as a way of understanding our lives just has massively declined, right? The left hasn't been, in the United States, the left hasn't been strong enough to take that and politicize that in a way that's really cut through. But the far right has been very effective, because what the far right is doing is basically saying, the return of the social is a demand on you to start caring about other people. And that is offensive to you. and you shouldn't have to care about that. And we're going to tell you and give you permission not to care about that. That's the essential kind of core appeal of it, I think. And so it builds on that kind of neoliberal idea of rejecting social obligations, but also draws on the chaos and the collapse of neoliberalism at the same time. So it's the perfect kind of combination to appeal in this moment of this kind of very particular crisis of neoliberalism. So I think that's the kind of emotional appeal of Trumpism and of the far right in lots of other places as well. And what it's offering is it says you don't have to care. In fact, we're going to glorify and celebrate a kind of reassertion of your sovereignty through racial and gender domination, right? So all the anti-woke stuff that comes in, which is central here, right, is working in precisely that way. It's not exactly the same as the way racism and sexism would have worked 50 years ago. It's reworking all kinds of boundaries, reworking the kind of emotional chemistry of these things to fit this particular moment. And this is what's so interesting to me is that, if you think about comparing Trump to Harris, if you think about the Make America Great Again slogan, you think that it's nostalgia on the Trump side, right? Actually, I think that the Kamala Harris campaign is the nostalgia campaign. They're the ones who are thinking that we can just through a little bit of, a technocratic nudge here and there, go back to the kind of glory days of the neoliberal 1990s. And, with America dominant and the sole superpower and everything working, which is a fantasy and a delusion, right? We're not in that world anymore. Trumpism actually speaks to the 21st century, right? And this comes to the second part of this, which is Trumpism is the war on terror coming home, right? So here you have to think about, I'm thinking of Aimé Césaire's formula of the imperial boomerang, right? Like every form of imperialism eventually comes home in the form of fascism, right? That's what I think is going on here. Now, in this particular case with the war on terror, that's happening in multiple ways. So one way it's happening is you have, the veterans, right, who fought in these wars during the Bush years, during the Obama years, right? And they were told, we have to surveil and track and use violence to destroy this nebulous enemy called radical Islam. And they were sent off to do that. And they pretty soon realized that the whole thing was based on lies. And the idea of a kind of virtuous and all-powerful America kind of died on those battlefields in Helmand and Haditha, right? So, and those veterans experienced that firsthand. They, more than anyone, know the truth of that. And they saw through that lie. The question is, what do they do with that? And certainly some of them move on to a position where they begin to question the whole setup, right? 4,000 veterans turned up at the Standing Rock protests, saying, we apologize for the history of US colonialism that we previously believed in, and stood ready to fight with the indigenous people. But for a significant number of veterans, what they did is they rejected the idea of US wars abroad. They said, well, we were tricked by this elite that wanted the US to be all over the world upholding, some set of global norms, right? And that isn't what the US should be doing. We shouldn't be the world's policeman. We don't want to do that anymore. But then they go on to think about that in terms of a conspiracy theory, a racist conspiracy theory, right? It's a liberal elite with its woke values that is trying to replace white people by bringing in, brown immigrants to replace us, right? And they're soft on Islam. There's, the Muslim enemy, they still believe in it, right? So that becomes the base for Trumpism. You remember that when Trump's beginning his political career, the first move he makes is under Obama is the birther stuff, right? That's actually his first entry into the political space. And that makes a name for him. And it actually, more or less, he's the one who popularized that Islamophobic idea that Obama was a Muslim born in Kenya, right? Then when he actually enters the Republican primary contest, no one takes him seriously. He doesn't have much support until at the end of 2015, he introduces the idea of the Muslim ban. And that's what really turbocharges his campaign. And of course, the reason it's appealing is because it resonates with what Obama and Bush have been telling Americans for more than 10 years at that point, which is, there is something suspicious about Muslims, right? That's why we've got this $1 trillion war on terror going on, right? So he's making explicit in his rhetoric what has always been implicit in the war on terror, right? Again, it's the war on terror coming home. And that's what really launches him so that, through 2016, he's able to win the primary and then win that election. Now that he's in office, the mass deportations that he's talking about, that's going to be deployed through the Department of Homeland Security, right? This sprawling, costly thing that's meant to protect us from threats that never actually gives us any genuine sense of security. This thing that was created after 9/11 will be the vehicle that Trump uses to implement that. It was built up and, expanded massively by liberals as much as conservatives, by the establishment Democrats, right? So look at who Trump has appointed to be the UN representative, Elise Stefanik, right? Elise Stefanik is a far-right politician who believes in the Great Replacement theory, right? A racist theory. She supported the January 6th insurrection. And just under a year ago, the New York Times described her as a voice of reason, right? Not even in an op-ed, but in an actual news report. Why? Well, because they strongly supported and approved of her haranguing college presidents for not doing enough to repress students who are protesting against the genocide, right? And now, having platformed her like that, given her that kind of support, she's going to be central to Trump's foreign policy, right? Again, it's for liberals enabling fascism and then being surprised when it gains power. So, I think this is the crucial kind of point that we need to get at. We need to look at how throughout the neoliberal era, you've had an elite that has talked about diversity and inclusion and racial equality and so on. But at the same time has expanded borders, expanded military spending, expanded prisons, expanded policing, and done all of these things in the name of an idea that Black people, Muslims, migrants are by nature culturally a threat, right? That's the underlying logic to it that becomes explicit in moments of challenge, but is always there implicitly as well, right? And so, all the attempts by the establishment Democrats to represent themselves as the anti-fascists, as the anti-racists, come into contradiction with the record of what they've actually done in terms of building up these structural racisms, right? These infrastructures of violence at the border, in prisons, in terms of the war on terror, right? In terms of policing. And that's now coming back to bite. It's precisely what Césaire was talking about. Fascism is not this kind of sudden rupture with liberal democracy. It's more like the return to the core countries of a liberal imperialism that's always been fascist in its forms as it's been deployed abroad. All right, so you had Kamala Harris echoing Biden in saying, Trump is an existential threat to American democracy, right? So if that's the case, it's just a matter of logic that you give up a lot of things to defend democracy, right? You give up commitments that are less central than the preservation of democracy. So if you actually thought that your absolute unquestioning support for a genocide was going to endanger democracy in the United States, you might want to think about giving that up, right? The fact that they didn't is telling. It tells you either that they consider supporting a genocide in Gaza more important than American democracy, or they didn't really believe that American democracy was under threat. I actually don't know which of those two it is. It's hard to tell. Here are the things that they could have done that would have recognized at least some of what was being asked of them, right? So the most minimal thing, of course, was allowing someone who could speak on behalf of Palestine at the DNC, right, which they refused to do. What should be for anyone who calls themselves a liberal, an absolute commitment here is obviously a refusal to provide military, financial, diplomatic support to an ongoing genocide. I mean, that's obviously got to be the basic requirement. But even if that you feel is politically too much, how about saying, we will suspend arms sales pending an investigation of whether war crimes have taken place, even if you don't want to use the word genocide, right? All kinds of formula you could come up with. None of it, right? What's so striking is the absolute refusal to have even the most minimal kind of rhetorical commitment to recognizing this mass movement that had emerged to protest against what Israel's doing. Compare that to 2020, right? When you have the Black Lives Matter uprising, Biden kind of gives a little nod to it. He doesn't, it's not like he's going to actually, defund the police or anything like that in his administration. No one believes that, but he gives a little nod to it. He says, this is a real issue, right? Minimal, but what that makes possible is the energy on the streets to channel into the election, right? And in my view, to a large extent, kind of kill a lot of that energy and absorb it into a deadening kind of elite process. Nevertheless, if you want to win an election, maybe that's a smart thing to do. On Palestine, absolutely not. Absolutely none of that, right? So, that's a big part of why they lost. We don't know if you just look at the numbers of people who voted for the Green Party or other candidates outside of the Dems and Republicans, it probably didn't shift enough to have made the difference. There's no doubt that it created an atmosphere where she couldn't bring her base to support her, and it fractured her. The movement that there could have been to bring her into office. So, absolutely no doubt about that. It seems like 50% or so of Muslims who would normally have voted Democrat didn't vote Democrat. I think that's part of it, but I think it's much broader than that. I think that it created this sense that this is not a candidate who really believes in anything, right? There's no consistency there, right? Because obviously you can't, on the one hand, talk about a rules-based international order. I mean, if you're serious about a rules-based international order, one of those rules is don't genocide, right? It is a pretty clear-cut rule if you're going to have a rules-based international order, and there's a requirement that when there's a genocide, other countries have to suspend their support for that country, right? So all of that is pretty clear-cut, I think. What I argued in What is Anti-Racism is there's two kinds of anti-racism, right? There's a kind of liberal anti-racism, which I think is perhaps embodied above all in people like Obama and Kamala Harris, and there's a radical anti-racist tradition. And the key difference between them is liberal anti-racists think of racism in terms of kind of individual irrational attitudes, right? That's the core problem, right? And so when you look at something like Trump, he is understood by them as someone who is manipulating a kind of reservoir of racial prejudices in the general population, whose existence cannot really be explained in the liberal view. It just kind of comes from somewhere. We don't really know where. Perhaps it's a legacy of the past in some sense, but it's not very clear. And so the danger comes from Trump exploiting those attitudes to threaten liberal democracy, right? It's the model of Hitler, right? It's the way that liberals understood what happened in the 1930s in Germany, right? A reservoir of anti-Semitism in the general population of Germany, exploited by a kind of charismatic extremist politician, right? Now, radical anti-racists look at what happened in Germany in the 1930s differently, right? As someone like Césaire would argue, it wasn't just this thing that's a story just about Germany. It's about how German colonialism, European colonialism, deploys all kinds of political practices in other parts of the world, like genocide, suppression of freedom of speech, mass displacement of peoples, torture, et cetera, and then those practices eventually come back to the supposedly liberal democratic home country in Europe, and that's when we call it fascism, right? It's doing to Europeans what had long been done to people in other parts of the world, and so on that view, we need to fight racism and fascism by looking at the ways that the normal functioning of the system creates these infrastructures of racial violence, right? And so for our time, that is the war on terror, that is mass incarceration, that is the militarization of the police, that is the system of bordering that is essentially a system of racial segregation, right? That segregates working peoples on the basis of race, right? In order to better exploit people who are racialized as different, right? Both in terms of keeping people out of the core imperialist countries to maintain a wage differential, but also to produce a kind of undocumented workforce within a country like the United States that can be more highly policed and therefore more highly exploited, right? So, it's the reason that we have this highly militarized border that causes thousands and thousands of people to die every year is not because there are prejudiced people in Texas, right? That's the liberal theory, right? It's not that. Give your ICE officials really good racial awareness training, right? We're still going to deport the same number of people. Maybe they do it in a politer way, right? But they're still deporting that huge number of people every year because they need that to maintain that racial division of labor across the world, right? And so that's what we need to understand. And then when you have those infrastructures like the border, like the police, like the military, who understand what they're doing in these racialized ways, that's like this permanent charging station for fascist movements to absorb this political energy and the racist conceptualizations that circulate in these infrastructures, and to draw strength from them, right? And that's precisely why the neoliberal era which produces all these infrastructures, also produces an ever-growing far-right movement. We've seen this since the 1980s, the revival of the far-right. It's steadily increasing in Europe and the United States every year. So to fight that, we're not going to do that by, we're not going to do it through kind of bias training and kind of white people kind of turning inwards to think about their implicit biases and unconscious prejudices and all this kind of stuff that we're asked to do. It's going to come through collective action, right? To dismantle these infrastructures. That's actually, when we're dealing with a power structure, the only way you can actually dismantle a power structure and build something new is if you're able to have collective action. It's not going to come through it's not going to come actually in the end through elections, because elections are kind of by default statistical exercises that aggregate individual preferences. They're not really venues of collective action. So we need to be organised. And right now I think that kind of it's organising outside of the electoral cycle that is going to be key. Connect with other people. Build those political relationships, demonstrate at whatever level you can that it is possible to do this thing, which the technocrats and the neo-fascists both think is not possible, which is for human beings to come together as equals and collectively shape social and political institutions to shape their future, right? Like that basic thing, right? Of can we actually make collective decisions together as equals? We don't have much social experience of that at this point, right? The kind of collective values that animated the mass movements of a century ago have been buried by neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism is constantly telling us you're just an individual. Your job is to compete with other individuals to maximize your personal benefits. Everything's a market transaction, right? It's that kind of culture that is unraveling. But at the same time, we haven't been able to build the kind of collective culture. And without that, our movements never really get started. We're just in spontaneous outbursts of rage against this setup, but we're never really building anything to move beyond it. We need to just get back to basics, get organized. You know, Maurice Bishop, the leader of the Grenada Revolution, said organization is our greatest weapon, right? In fact, it's our only weapon, but it's the only weapon we need, actually, as well.